Und dann möchte ich jetzt alle recht herzlich willkommen heißen zum GeStEIN Kolloquium im Wintersemester 2021. Wir gehen jetzt heute in die zweite Runde und heute ist unser erster Termin mit dem heutigen Vortrag, den ich jetzt noch einmal kurz vorstellen möchte und natürlich auch dem Redner, den ihr ja auch schon sehen könnt. Wenn jetzt hier meine Präsentation funktioniert, doch, sie tut es. So, und der heutige Vortrag wird gehalten von Dr. Henk Kombrink vom North Sea Core und trägt den Titel How Developments in the Northwest European Energy System Drive a Wealth of New Subsurface Insights. Ich möchte Herrn Kombrink zunächst kurz vorstellen. Studiert hat er, wie wir alle oder zumindest wie die meisten von uns, Geowissenschaften, und zwar an der Universität Utrecht. An dieser hat er auch seine Promotion absolviert und hat dabei das Carbon der Niederlande erforscht. Anschließend ist Herr Kombrink zunächst als Geologe beim Geological Survey of the Netherlands bei der TNO oder zu Deutsch mit diesem schönen Titel Niederländische Organisation für angewandte naturwissenschaftliche Forschung tätig gewesen. Anschließend ging er in die Industrie und hat als Research Geologist bei Total E&P UK Limited und als Senior Geologist bei Lloyd's Register gearbeitet. Dabei ist er vor allem als Petroleum Geologist tätig gewesen und hat sich viel mit Reservoiren beschäftigt, wie man diese findet und ja. Zusätzlich seit 2020 ist Herr Kombrink Editor-in-Chief für das Netherlands Journal of Geoscience und außerdem auch Editor für Geopublishing AS oder auch Autor bei expronews.com und eben seit 2018 Direktor von North Sea Core. Und da möchte ich jetzt nicht so viel hervorgreifen, da Herr Kombrink auch darüber noch was erzählen wird, was es damit genau auf sich hat. Und dann bin ich eigentlich soweit schon fertig und würde gerne an Herrn Kombrink das Wort übergeben. Dazu beende ich einmal meine Bildschirmpräsentation.
Thank you very much, Robin, for the introduction. I will continue the talk in English, if you don't mind. I just told Robin I once went for a job interview at the BGR in Hanover, and I was expecting the interview to be in English, but it turned out to be in German, and I stumbled through. It was a bit of a shock for me. I do speak a few words of German, but not enough, I'm afraid, to do this presentation in German in full, so bear with me. So thanks again, Robin, for the introduction. The first talk, or the first part of this talk today, is what the title suggests. It's really about current activities in the North Sea, or the greater North Sea area. That's where I kind of report on a daily basis for this website, expronews.com, that Robin just mentioned. I write about one article a day on current developments in the North Sea and Northwest Europe with a subsurface angle. So I still use my geological knowledge a lot, actually. And besides that, I also run North Sea Core, which I will dedicate kind of 1/3 of the presentation to near the end, where I'll show you what we do as an organization in terms of trying to rehome abandoned core, and you see some samples here in the background of my title slide. That's some different types of core we get from the UK continental shelf, from the North Sea, from companies who get rid of this because it doesn't really represent a lot of value to them anymore. But there's a lot of things you can do with it, and that's what I'd like to explain a bit more about. Just to add to the introduction, I am currently based in Aberdeen in Scotland, and this is the house where I'm currently sitting. behind this window over here. It's dark now, but just to give you an impression of where I'm sitting at the moment. And yeah, I grew up in the north of the Netherlands in a hamlet called Kostvlies, not too far from the German border, actually. And then I moved to Utrecht to study, do my PhD and work for a bit. So I was there for quite a while, about 13 years. And then I thought, well, it's time to move on. And I joined Total, as Robin just said, in Aberdeen in Scotland. So that's 10 years ago now. I've been in Aberdeen for 10 years, and we never really expected to be here for 10 years, but yeah, at some point you settle down, I suppose. And life is not too bad in Scotland at all. So, and it's not too far from the Netherlands either, either by ferry or by plane. It's not too bad. And yeah, so the other job I've got, which does take most of my time, is writing for the website, and that is run from Norway. So since I'm doing that, so that's a bit more than a year now, I've got an increasing kind of network and in Norway as well. So in that sense, I am kind of doing my rounds across the North Sea to a certain extent, which is really nice. So let's start the presentation a bit. And I always like to have a look back first into times when we didn't really know much at all about the North Sea or the geology of the North Sea and further north as well. And this map, I think, really illustrates that nicely. It is from a paleogeographic atlas published in 1956. And it really shows what type of geology was very well known at the time, and that was the coal mining areas over here. You can see them in dark red. That's where our energy was coming from at the time, and this is really just before the exploration in the North Sea started. If we go back a bit further even, so initially the coal mining areas were really kind of situated here, and then in the Netherlands, there was a push to find more coal slightly further north than the mining area in the extreme south of the country. And that is really the moment, that's the early 1900s. That's when kind of exploration of the deeper subsurface started. And that is shown in this slide over here. So we are looking at, so this is the province of Limburg. And this is where the coal mining started, so in the 1800s already. So this is where the Carboniferous even outcrops. We've got one tiny outcrop of the Carboniferous in the Netherlands over here, very close to the Belgium and Dutch or German border. Of course, it's being overlain by chalk if you go further north, but still it's at mineable depths. But as you can imagine, in the early 1900s, there was a push from the government to find more coal because that was the most important resource at the time. So, that is really when the Geological Survey was born. So we're talking 1902 or 1903. The first director, he drilled a few wells in what is now known as the Ruhr Valley Graben. It's part of the European Cenozoic Rift system. So this blue area over here, drilled a few wells, but only never found the Carboniferous because it's very deeply buried. This is definitely an important graben system where the Tertiary or the Cenozoic is already very thick. And then you still need to go through the Cretaceous and the Jurassic, etc. So the Carboniferous is really not mineable here. So the director of the survey, the first director, he resigned because he wasn't successful. And then the second one, he actually went to have a look in Germany, and he found this, he looked at the map and looked at the landscape and thought this fault system that continues into Germany was known at the time. And in the Netherlands, if you go further north, this fault system, he could kind of trace that into the Netherlands. And this is how it looks like in the landscape. It's a very subtle jump in the terrain. For the Netherlands, for the Dutch, this is quite a lot of relief already. So he thought, okay, if this kind of subtle terrain, step in the terrain represents a major fault system, then maybe I have to drill my exploration wells on the high block of it, on the host block. And that's what he did. So he drilled, or he didn't drill himself, but he kind of designed a few wells over here. And that's where they found coal-bearing successions at mineable depths. So still quite deep, about 600 meters to a kilometer, I think. But it is mineable, and that was a major success for the geological survey. And I think I always look at this as the first step towards exploring the deeper subsurface of the Netherlands. So I think that's always a nice anecdote to start with. And as you can see, this is the digital terrain model that is available for the Netherlands. And you can very subtly see this. If you can project a line here, this is where the fault is situated. So again, it's subtle, but it's present in the terrain. So now let's go back to the map I showed you at the start, and jump back or jump forward in time to the year 1959, and that's when the famous Groningen field was found by a joint venture between Exxon and Shell. It's called NAM, the Netherlands Oil Company. And the discovery of gas in the Groningen field, which is reservoired in the Rotliegen, so that's upper Permian sandstones, very well known in Germany as well. It was that discovery that really triggered exploration across the North Sea, because very quickly geologists realized that, okay, there may be gas here, but we know that there is similar types of Aeolian Rotliegen sandstones in the Durham area in the UK. So maybe they are linked, maybe they also occur in the North Sea. So that is really the starting point of exploration across the North Sea. So and that's what happens, and now we can get rid of these question marks, because since then loads of wells have been drilled. And this animation, hopefully it's going to work. So this is an animation I made on the left-hand side of using the stratigraphic information of all the wells drilled so far up to 2019 in the UK sector of the North Sea. So that's here, the Dutch sector, the German sector, the Entenschnabel here, the Denmark and Norway. So that amounts to about how many, 6,000 or so, 7,000 exploration and appraisal wells. And if you combine the well tops or the stratigraphic information from all these wells, what I could do, I could deduct whether a well kind of hits the basement, drills the Devonian, Carboniferous, etc. So we are going up in time, and you will see more and more wells appearing, because obviously the shallower, the more likely it was drilled. So all these dots represent single wells, and it's quite easy now to envisage that. Well, looking at the map in the previous slide, there was no single well, and now there's thousands of them. So we know a lot more about the geology and the stratigraphy of the North Sea just now. These maps are also part of a publication you can find in the Geological Society. So should you be interested in that, and the data set is also publicly available, just drop me a line, and my email will be at the last slide. So using the information of all these wells, this kind of very basic geological map can be constructed of the entire North Sea. And I think this map captures the most important elements of the North Sea as they are now. So in blue, you see the classic Jurassic graben system that developed, as I said, in the late Jurassic, early Cretaceous. That's when the North Sea experienced a very important rift phase. due to well, that was kind of the onset of Atlantic rifting over here. But first, the North Sea tried to split up, which wasn't successful. It didn't continue into a full rift. But still, this rift system is very important because, as you can see, most oil and gas fields, especially here in the central North Sea, the northern North Sea, all these green and yellow, or green, red, and orange blobs, they represent oil, gas, and condensate fields. So they really cluster in the area where the Jurassic graben is, and that is really because the oil source rock, which is the Kimmeridge clay, it's an upper Jurassic marine source rock, was deposited in the graben and subsequently subsided to depths where it started generating oil and gas, mostly oil, I must say. That's why you will find mostly green oil fields in this area. In the south, it is slightly different. This is called the Southern North Sea, or the Southern Permian Basin, which does extend, as many of you will know, into Germany, into Poland. So it's much more of an east-west trending basin. And all these gas fields we see, there's mostly gas, they rely on source rocks from the Carboniferous. So these are Carboniferous coals deposited during the late Carboniferous. Again, all in the entire area from onshore England all the way to Poland. And these coals have been buried deep enough to generate gas, which then mainly migrated into the Rotliegend, so the upper Permian sandstones, where they were found initially here in the major Groningen field, this biggest blob over here. So it is quite surprising, isn't it, that no wells being drilled, and the first one immediately finds the biggest field. It's and it's always happening like that. It's and despite all the, well, there was hardly any data, especially if you look nowadays how much data we've got. But the biggest fields are always found at the start. So that's the kind of setting of the North Sea in a very quick overview, and through using this animation, you've got an idea at least of how many wells have been drilled so far. So it is a lot. So you might think, after all this drilling, that this started in 1960s, 1970s, and with a peak in the 1980s and 90s. Why is there still drilling? Why is it still going on? Because you would argue most volumes have been found, and that is true. And I think this slide, I think, illustrates that to a certain extent. If you look at the early discoveries in the North Sea, fields like, you may not have heard, Brent, it's a famous one, 40s. These fields were found in the early days of exploration, so early 70s, and they represented a big volumes. Like Brent has produced about 2,000 million barrels, so that's 2 billion barrels in total. Brent is not producing anymore, but 40s is. So one of the early finds, but still producing today, 50 years later. If you look at today, 2021, the average discovery in the North Sea, and that is across the board from either Norway or the UK or the Dutch sector, kind of the average find is about 40 million barrels, which is tiny compared to the early discoveries. And I think that really puts things into a bit of perspective, which I think is good to be aware of. Regardless of whether you're against oil or gas or for oil or gas, it is important to realize that at the moment, the North Sea, and that includes Norway, which is by far the country with the biggest reserves still. But even in Norway, if you look at exploration, the average size of discoveries, and many are smaller than this, that is what is left. So we are really at the tail end of exploration in Northwest Europe, and I think that is important to bear in mind. So again, going back to that question, so what remains to be drilled here when again in gray there's all the wells plotted that have been drilled, so you would think, well, is there anything left to explore for? Well, but there is. So this map, which I have produced for Expert News, this shows all the wells that were completed this year. So as you can see, that's quite a few. Most of them are in the Norwegian sector, including the Barents Sea, for instance, which is can be seen as the area that is less or least explored. But recent finds haven't really been very promising at all. So it's there's a bit of a question mark for the Barents Sea at the moment, whether it's worth exploring because it hasn't been very successful. But I think if you try to categorize the wells that are currently being drilled in this area, I think you can distinguish them between niche plays targeting, well, plays that haven't been really explored yet, or near field exploration, some a little bit more frontier, so in areas where we don't know much about. And I think an important factor, and this includes Germany as well, is the drilling of geothermal wells. And I will give an example of all four of those categories to illustrate what the title of the talk is really about, is that using that information from these new wells, we still learn a lot about the geology of this whole area, which I think is quite interesting. So first of all, let's look at a bit of a niche play. And this example is from the Netherlands, from the offshore area just north of the Wadden Islands over here. And you can see the Groningen fields to set the scene. So the first discovery in 1959. So this is the big Rotliegend field. And if we draw a quick cross section from north to south, we see that the Slochteren sandstone, that is the most important reservoir here in Groningen. But thanks to all these wells drilled, there was the strong belief that the Slochteren sandstone was pinching out further north, as it does. But so in this area, so this green line represents that northern pinch out line of the Slochteren sandstone, right? So common belief until very recently was that there was not much to be found here. But then a small company came along, Hansa Hydrocarbons. They had acreage both in the German sector and in the Dutch sector, and drilled a well over here and found gas, not in the classical Slochteren sandstone, but in the so-called basal sands, which do occur in Germany a lot more. But in the Netherlands, it was kind of tested a few times, but nothing promising. And they found gas in this field, which was quite a surprise. And especially if you look back, for decades, Groningen was very close, but the area wasn't really looked at much more because it was the belief that nothing was could be found there, until someone came along and pushed it. And I think that is really an example of a niche play. It doesn't mean that there's a lot of gas. Compared to Groningen, it's a fraction, but still it is an important illustration of how you can still target smaller volumes in an area where people may even think of like, oh, there's nothing left to be found. And this is a quick cross section through that area. And you can see the very thin Rotliegend sandstones reservoir here, nicely faulted into fault blocks with the Rotliegend, the GeStEIN on top acting as a seal, and the Rotliegend silver pit, sorry, the silver pit shales and the GeStEIN on top. Let's have a look at an example of how near field exploration helps to kind of add some more volumes to what is being found. And we are looking at the Norwegian Sea over here in this area. So as you can see, the gray dots, lots of wells being drilled already. So the area, we call it, is quite mature in terms of exploration and development potential. But you see a trend recently where companies, rather than targeting the classical Middle Jurassic sandstones, as shown here on this stratigraphic diagram, rather than targeting those, there's a trend of targeting these Cretaceous sandstones. The Liesing and the Lange formation are the most common names in there. These are turbiditic sandstones shed from the Norwegian mainland into the basin at the time. But the difference really between these sandstones and the ones from the Middle Jurassic is that they are thinner and more complicated to prove and to map, and also connectivity within reservoirs is a bit more of a challenge. If you look at a cross section across the Norwegian Sea, this is kind of nicely illustrated. So these are in blue. You see this is the Middle Jurassic. It's a lot more faulted than the Cretaceous, but the reservoirs are mostly thicker, and that's where the classic reservoirs in the Norwegian Sea are located. As an example, the Skarv field is an example of that. What companies are now increasingly exploring in the Norwegian Sea is the Cretaceous. So it's part of the post-drift, not as faulted, so subtle traps, thinner sandstone. So it's quite a challenge occasionally to find those volumes in the Cretaceous, but it's still paying off as kind of near field exploration. And this slide shows that into a bit more perspective. A map of the Norwegian Sea in kind of in palish colors, slightly faded. That's the classical Middle Jurassic reservoirs. And these are in green, red here. That's the ones reservoired in Cretaceous turbiditic sandstone. So looking at a map, they seem big compared to the classical fields over here. But okay, they may be big in extent, but the reservoir quite often is thin. So the volumes in these fields is generally a lot smaller than in the classic Middle Jurassic finds. But still, because there is infrastructure in place to produce from these fields, it is relatively easy to tap into these reserves in the Cretaceous. So a really good example of near field exploration. And as a backdrop, this is a core from one of these Cretaceous wells drilled to target the Cretaceous, and you can see how challenging the reservoir can be. So it's really thin bedded sandstone, so it's not the easiest one to produce even gas from. And as an example, this well, Black Vulture, or this little blob here, was appraised just a few months ago by Equinor, the biggest Norwegian oil company. They drilled a well here to appraise it, and it was dry. So it was an example, I think, again, to me that, okay, it was drilled within the mapped perimeter of the field, but it was dry. So it's hard to predict what the extent really is of these fields. Then, as I said, a little bit more frontier kind of exploration is taking place occasionally. And I'm just showing you one of those, which is the Stovegolvet well, situated just to the east of the main area where most wells are found. And this is a map showing where it was situated in the so-called Stort Basin, which is another Jurassic basin just east of the Viking Graben over here. So this is the main basin where the source rock is present, plus buried to a depth where it started generating. The Stort Basin, hardly any wells, so much more frontier. And the risk being, okay, the source rock may be there, but it may not be mature. And that is what this cross-section shows. The well drilled here, it turned out to be dry, and the likely cause of that is that the source rock in the Jurassic was not buried deep enough to generate oil or gas that can then move into any reservoirs. So again, by drilling that well, and that happened this year, it wasn't successful, but it still adds a very valid data point to this area that hasn't been drilled much at all before. An example quickly of a few geothermal wells. So that's the kind of fourth category of a very exciting thing that is actually happening at the moment, with a few very deep wells being drilled across the area. And I'd like to mention one of those, or maybe two, and that's happening in Cornwall in the south west of England, where there is a series of granites, and these granites are being targeted by very deep wells to produce hot water from, to produce electricity ultimately. United Downs drilled to 5 kilometers, and Eden also 5 kilometers, very just completed last month. So major projects takes months to drill, and with the aim to have 2 wells drilled through a fault zone in the granitic basement to produce hot water from around 4 kilometers, pump it up, produce electricity, and then inject it back. So, and these are major investments, and it's let's see how successful this is going to be. I think personally there's quite a risk of induced seismicity. That's, as some of you may know, that's something that happened in Basel, and also in France. There was an issue with that. If you drill into basement, it is quite prone to seismic activity, seismicity. So let's see how this develops in Cornwall. In Münsterland, that's another area where there's quite a lot of interest at the moment, with seismic surveys being acquired this year along the southern margin, potentially targeting the Devonian at 6 kilometers depth over here. The same in the middle of the basin, close to Münster. There's a survey going on at the moment, or will start very soon, also looking into the potential of both the Cretaceous and potentially the Devonian, very deeply buried. So if a well is going to be drilled either here or here, it will add a lot more information. So again, exciting times. And that is really what this conclusion is about. I think in the interest of time, I will probably continue, because I see that I've got about 10 minutes left before the Q&A starts. So let's jump to this and say, ask the question, okay, what's happening to all these fields that are currently here that are increasingly abandoned? Because that is what is happening in the North Sea big time now. There's lots of fields are near the end of their production life, and companies are increasingly just pulling the plug and deciding to leave the field behind. And that's in a way an interesting process, because all the core that was obtained from these reservoirs, the company half of the core is already at the British Geological Survey, half of the core is company owned, and that is now being disposed of in an organized way, I should say. But when I heard this happening, and that's about 4 years ago, I thought, well, that's a great opportunity to have some core, because I grew up knowing how unique it is, and you can never have a piece. So that's how North Sea Core started. First of all, in my garage over here, just a few meters away from me. I just had a pile of boxes, as you can see. This is the 2017-18 edition. Yeah, so that quickly grew. But at the time, we were, well, we already had a website. I had teamed up with Kirsty Wright, so we are the 2 directors now. And this is, for instance, 2 guys from Karlsruhe University who drove all the way, well, primarily to do field work in the UK, but they also drove past Aberdeen and collected a pile of boxes for their university for teaching purposes. And yeah, this is, again, this is our core store at the moment. I'll come back to that in the next slide. So really, we were set up really as a response to the release of that offshore core material and the value it has. And we really try to kind of use it for education rather than it being disposed, because it's so valuable material. And this is how the garage looks like at the moment. So this is called North Sea Core HQ. It's just a garage, really, with some nice shelves. And this is where all the cut kind of pieces of core are stored, and we prepare them for shipment. And this is, like I just said, this is the core store, which is just a farm north of Aberdeen, so 15 minutes drive from here, and this is where we store all of our material. And so far we have been donated core from about 11 companies, soon to be 12 this Friday, which is always very exciting to get a new delivery. And it's like a kid in a sweet shop, isn't it? Being a geologist and opening these boxes of core to see what is in there. With that core, we kind of upcycle this and distribute this to the wider geological community, and try to kind of well, make it useful for teaching, but also facilitate research into the energy transition. And I think another element is to help preserve our offshore heritage. And combining that with offshore data, which is currently available through the Oil and Gas Authority National Data Repository, we can add a lot of data, all from the public domain, to these cores, which adds a lot of perspective. And this is just an example of the variety of cores we've got, ranging from the Carboniferous all the way to the Paleocene, both half-cut core, as you can see here, but also slabbed and resonated core, which really lends itself very nicely for teaching and inspection, and not only for petroleum geology, but also just for students to learn to interpret deep position environments, for instance. Because the North Sea, there's a whole raft of different deep position environments that have all been cored. So it's a unique archive in that sense. And this is an example just quickly of another thing you can do with core. And this is what we did in April this year. We laid an entire Brent core from the northern North Sea out vertically, because only then you kind of appreciate the scale of the thickness of a reservoir, which ended up, well, it's very close to the sea. You can see here in the background, this was 150 meters of core. So in a really impressive succession, and to walk along that really is so much nicer than being in a core store where the core is just nicely laid out box by box. This is the field where it's from, and the section is here. So a seismic section through this field. And the section that was laid out in the field was just this. So on seismic, it looks like nothing. If you walk along it in the field, you really appreciate that it is quite an extensive column as such. And this is an aerial picture from the field. And this line is the core that was laid out, about 150 meters. And you can then compare it to the comp log and do some well, wiggling, because this is the gamma ray. We turned out to have forgotten a gap here. You can see there was no core taken here. We forgot that. So we had to do some squeezing in order for it to line up, but that happened. And the gray colors represent the mudstones, and the brownish colors, that's the oil stained sands, are now lining up nicely with the gamma rays over here. So this was a really nice exercise. It was hard work though, lots of boxes, but it really makes you appreciate how a reservoir looks like in thickness. Something else we do in terms of exporting the geology of the North Sea, we also frame some of our cores, so like the resonated slabs for people to hang on their wall. So for private collections, but also really anyone who wants this can be in touch, really. And we also do some office displays now and then. This is a display of 5 very characteristic cores from the North Sea. We did for Shell in London in 2019, but also as gifts and more like exploration boxes for display. So this is really the upcycling element of what we can do with these cores that, again, would otherwise have been ended on a landfill site. But really the bulk of what we do is supply core for teaching, and that is kind of illustrated here. So a very important element is providing teaching sets to universities which is really a cross-section of different types of deposition environments and ages, all the way from Devonian to the Eocene. So we put that together and ship that on pallets to anywhere, really. And this is an example of students in France having a practical looking at all these cores. And I even joined them remotely to tell them a bit more about the context, etc. And we also do smaller kind of exploration boxes, which is just a wooden old core box containing of 5 different samples, again illustrating the kind of petroleum geology of the North Sea. And these also come with a poster to further illustrate or add some context to these bits. And core is also increasingly being used for research. For instance, this set we supplied to Geomar in Kiel a couple of years ago, and they used these bits to do CO2 injection tests with. So that really is an example of how these cores also facilitate research into the energy transition. But also for kind of cutting edge research on analysis. We supplied core to a company doing ChemScan analysis on half-cut core. So they used to do that, or they tested new methods using this core we supplied. And we've got kind of CT scans of a characteristic set of samples from the North Sea done by a company called Core Specialist Services here in Aberdeen, and these images are all available on the website. So that's also a kind of educational element to what we do. And this is just another example of a core we shipped to the US. We also, core was used for the BBC Christmas lectures by Chris Jackson, a well-known geologist, and he used our cores to illustrate what geology is all about. That was quite a moment for us. And we also supplied core to a big Amazon production called The Rig recently. And yeah, so that's just an example of the diversity of kind of things we supply core to, all with the aim to make it more accessible and to help dispelling the common myths about geology, like oil is in a cavity or something. It's these myths that a lot of people still firmly believe in. If we look at the numbers, we have shipped core mostly across Western Europe. As you can see, that's where most of our requests go to, but it's still an international market. We ship quite a lot to the US, Mexico and Canada, and even as far as Saudi Arabia and Australia and Korea as well recently. And just the other day, we had another request from a university in Saudi Arabia to supply a teaching set, which is quite nice, especially if you kind of, well, I've never been there, but I guess they've got a lot of core, and then getting in touch with us for a teaching set from the North Sea is quite nice to hear. So far we fulfilled about 380 requests. So it's something that really occupies quite a bit of our time, to be honest. So that's a quick introduction into North Sea core. Just as a reflection, kind of trying to capture the whole of the presentation. I think what I tried to kind of get across at the start is that the North Sea, in terms of exploration and also in terms of production, it's really nearing the tail end of its production lifetime. Also, if you look at the volume being found, it is really a fraction of what was found in the past. But still, even though we've got so many wells drilled and so many fields in production, there are still some areas where some more exploration can take place. And these wells, if you look at them a bit carefully, they still shed a lot more light on the geology of the area. And that's what I find quite intriguing, and I'm kind of happy to report on that on a daily basis. But once all these fields kind of are taken out of production, North Sea core really comes in there, and we really try to kind of save some of that to kind of distribute to the wider geological community, to really facilitate research into geology education and helping to teach the next generation of geoscientists. So should you have any questions about all this, please get in touch through our North Sea Core Gmail account or address. If you'd like to follow the news about subsurface type of elements happening in Northwest Europe, you can always have a look at the website I write for, which is called explorenews.com. And that's about it from me. Thanks for your attention, and I'm happy to try to answer any questions if there are any.